Good morning, all. I'm happy to bid you a cordial welcome. We're delighted to have you with us today. This is the Symposium on Non-Conventional Waters to Achieve Food Security. You have English, Spanish, and French on different channels. Thank you very much.
En primer lugar, quería decirles que, como han visto, estamos encantados de tenerles aquí y la organización, la FAO, el Ministerio de Agricultura, la Casa de América han hecho todo lo posible para que se sientan en casa y hemos hecho que tengan la suficiente agua para esta reunión, como han podido comprobar esta mañana. Está previsto que la escasez de agua aumente con el aumento de las temperaturas globales como resultado del cambio climático. Ese es el objetivo de desarrollo sostenible 6 de la Agenda 2030. El sector del agua se encuentra, sin duda, en un momento crucial. Encontrar soluciones innovadoras resulta esencial para alcanzar la seguridad alimentaria y una gestión.
And sustainable management of water. And this is why the United Nations Organization, FAO, and the government of Spain, via the Ministry of Food and Fisheries, have jointly organized this international symposium. The different sessions are going to allow us to heed experts from the world over. We're going to be talking about cutting-edge technologies applied to the use of non-conventional waters. Before I give the floor to our first speaker of the morning, I'd like to remind you, please, for those of you who wish to follow us, our Wi-Fi here today is in Casa, América, Anfiteatro, Casa, América, Anfiteatro, and the password is Anfiteatro.
You want to follow with Wi-Fi, you have to choose Casa América Anfiteatro. That's Casa América Anfiteatro, not Anfiteatro alone. And the password is Anfiteatro, Anfiteatro.
And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor now to our first speaker, Mr. René Castro, who is Assistant Director of FAO and in charge of the Department of Climate. The title actually is longer, but I'm just going to give the floor to René.
Gracias, Enrique.
Well, thank you, Enrique. Good morning, all colleagues, distinguished participants, guests, ladies and gentlemen. Why FAO? Why FAO? Because today FAO is taking a break to study the non-conventional use of water. FAO basically is in charge of foodstuffs and agriculture. We are forecasting that in a world with 10 billion human beings who need to eat, who need to move about, who need to communicate, who need housing, scientists tell us that of those current CO2 emissions, which are perhaps an average of 5 tons per capita, the US has 18 per capita. My country, less than 2, but the average is about 5. Scientists tell us we've got to bring it down to 1 ton per capita. 1 ton per capita if we are to achieve sustainability, which can assimilate or absorb about 10 gigatons per year. 10 billion persons, 1 ton per capita. Can we achieve this? The first tests, if you will, say yes, but we'll have to use pesticides and fertilizers better, and we'll have to make much better use of water. We are on that track. Are we? No, we're actually not. We are not. we are
más hacia los 4 grados Celsius,
advancing towards
sería
a
un
plus
colapso
4
para la
degrees,
humanidad, no un
and that
colapso
would be
económico,
collapse. It wouldn't be an
colapso para la
economic
humanidad,
collapse. No, I'm talking about
y
humanity
no
collapsing.
para la meta de 1.5
That's
o
definitely
que
not the
requeriría
target, which is
bajar
1.5
a 1 tonelada per cápita.
CO2.
El
What
Acuerdo
would
de
this
París
imply?
nos lleva
The
hacia
Paris
13 grados.
Accord brings us to
Si se
3
cumpliese.
degrees. If we were to achieve
¿Se
it,
está cumpliendo? No.
are we achieving it?
Los países
No, we are
distan mucho
not.
de acercarse a las metas que nos
We
hemos
are
puesto.
very far from achieving those objectives
Pero en
that
la
we set
materia
forth for
nuestra,
ourselves.
déjenme dar
But
algunos ejemplos
let me give
de
you
los
some
temas
few
que
examples
nos
of the issues
y nos
that
preocupan.
concern us, issues that we worry about.
Voy a cambiar a inglés por la
I'm
audiencia.
switching
Por
to
example,
English now.
Currently, 7.5% of the world's population relies on domestic desalinated seawater supply, and this is expected to rise to 18%. We are in a country that has some experience with desalination and salinated water and crops, but this is going to be a challenge for the world. In the past, it was unthinkable that desalinated water could be used for agriculture, only viable for high return crops, essentially cash crops. And we have some successful examples around the world, including southern Spain. Rainwater harvesting and its storage capacity for future use is particularly relevant for agriculture. Being able to store water during periods of abundance for moments when there is a scarcity is one of the fundamental advantages of this type of system. In some regions of Australia, up to 85% of the rainfall is collected and stored for future uses. USA, Israel, and Spain are also leading countries in the application of rainwater harvesting. Fog water collection has been successfully implemented in all continents, providing fresh water for drinking and agricultural activities. Fog water collection can produce an average of 6,300 liters per day, with some locations producing over 100,000 liters per day in some days, for example, in El Toro in Chile. Approximately 10% of the total global irrigated land area receive untreated or partially treated wastewater, encompassing 20 million hectares in 50 countries. It is estimated that well over 80% of wastewater worldwide, over 95% in some developing countries, is released into the environment without treatment, making water unsuitable for several uses due to its poor quality. The potential of treating and reusing wastewater has a huge potential in many areas of the globe, since the agricultural activities can reuse wastewater treated at different levels. A transition to a circular economy could also create significant synergies for the wide adoption of water use and reuse as a new source, especially in agriculture, with the triple dividend of creating an alternative option for water supply, water reuse, recycling, and reusing of nutrients, and a solution provider for water quality and food security. Permítame terminar con una anécdota. Yo soy de Costa Rica, país pequeño en el centro de América, y en una de las oportunidades en las que serví como ministro, teníamos una crisis de sequía, pensábamos nosotros. Ese año solo habían caído 1.100 milímetros de agua durante el año. Crisis nacional. Busqué alrededor del mundo. Me encontré con los colegas de Marruecos, los invité a Costa Rica a que nos ayudaran al tema de la sequía. Cuando llevo a los marroquíes y les dije, esta es el área seca, solo caen 1.100 milímetros al año. Ellos se volvían a ver y me decían, ¿110 milímetros al año? No, les decía yo, 1.100 milímetros al año. Me dijeron, no tenemos mucho que aconsejar, solo organicemos una misión que venga a Marruecos. Llevaron una misión de Costa Rica a áreas de Marruecos donde llovía 90 milímetros al año. Los costarricenses volvieron diciendo simplemente, no nos hemos dado cuenta que somos ricos en agua, y así como hay gente que desperdicia petróleo, nosotros desperdiciamos agua. Para alcanzar esa meta de una tonelada per cápita a partir del año 2050 para los 10 billones de personas, no podemos desperdiciar agua.
Not afford to waste water. There's just no room. We've got to recycle, we've got to reuse, and especially we've got to use less water per product, per ton production in the farming sector. And that's why we're here today. We're here to learn. So thank you very much for being here. We want to share, we want to learn, we want to be altruistic and join forces for the better good of humanity. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, René. Invito al podio.
Very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Danielle Gaillard Picher, who is VC of the Global Framework on Water Scarcity in Agriculture. You have the floor, ma'am.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity during this extremely important symposium to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Global Framework on Water Scarcity and Agriculture in a Changing Climate, or WASAG for short, in my capacity as Vice Chair and also on behalf of the World Water Council. For those of you who are perhaps not as familiar with WASAG, it comprises 60 organizations, and in its short 3-year history has already been endorsed by 83 ministers of agriculture and recognized by the agriculture ministers of the G20. It aims to deliver concrete outcomes, including non-conventional water use, to tackle the collective challenges of using water better in agriculture to ensure food security for all. It's for this reason that we're extremely happy to see the commitment of the partners here today to discuss how non-conventional waters can play a role in achieving food security. We all know agriculture is thirsty, and as quoted from WASAG's Rome statement, water scarcity is one of the leading challenges of the 21st century. While technological innovation will help reduce losses and increase in efficiency to reduce the supply and demand gap, so will new frameworks and financing structures encourage a change in approach and thinking. This is going to be absolutely necessary if we are going to be able to deliver on SDG 6 and SDG 2 simultaneously before 2030. This symposium is of even greater significance on the eve of COP25, which is going to be here in Madrid in just a few weeks' time, keeping in mind that WASAG was in fact launched at COP22 in Marrakesh. But what do we mean when we use the term non-conventional? One interpretation refers to something that is unestablished in practice or easily overlooked in favor of more customary solutions. I would posit that one of these non-conventional resources is in fact women. Women in innovation, women in decision-making and leadership, and especially women farmers. Women such as Harriet Williams Russell Strong, an inventor known for her water irrigation and reservoir designs in the American Southwest, or more recently, Sahrawi women in the Sahara Desert adapting hydroponic systems to produce fodder for their livestock year-round. Women like those that participated in the creation of the Network of Women Agriculture Ministers and Leaders in 2008. And women farmers like those in Senegal, where the next World Water Forum will be held in 2021. Women farmers make up 70% of the workforce in Senegal and produce more than 80% of crops. In most cases, they also manage the water use in the home, yet they have less access to financial resources, land, improved inputs, and agricultural information and technology compared to men, Unfortunately, this is the case in many developing countries. Women are essential to the development of the rural economy. Indeed, research shows that if women had the same access to productive resources as men, they would increase their farm yields by 20 to 30% and reduce hunger by up to 17%. How can we not regard their empowerment as a non-conventional resource? For WASAG, this symposium will be an important step forward in our quest to deal with water scarcity. Women farmers and women farmers need to be a part of this conversation. So I just kindly suggest that we keep this in mind over the course of the next 2 days as we discuss non-conventional resources and find ways for women to become an integral part of the solutions for addressing water scarcity and achieving food security in this context. Thank you once again to the organizers for inviting me and to everyone here. I would also like to invite you to bring all of your solutions regarding non-conventional use to the World Water Forum in Senegal in 2021. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Danielle. Es un placer para mí darle la palabra a la directora.
Delighted now to give the floor to Aina Calvo Sastre, Director of AECID Spain, the Spanish Agency of International Cooperation. You have the floor, ma'am.
Good morning, muy buenos días.
Hello, good morning. Director of the FAO Secretariat here in Spain, Deputy of FAO, and Undersecretary of the Ministry, and Casa América that welcomes us here. And thank you very much for having invited us to participate here. As we just heard, the Vice President of the global framework, the WASAG in agriculture, and therefore it is very important to say that food safety is of utmost importance for good feeding of the population. The figures that we have nowadays are very far from the ideal situation for the compliance with the SDGs, especially number 2, although it's not the only one, because we have to comply with the 17 SDGs. And we have to support all those policies with all the members that we work, that is to underline especially food, water, and in order to deal with non-conventional resources, especially in agriculture, it is very important first to reclaim and treat waters and with good legislation. So we need sectoral planning, and that is what we have been working with in the Cooperation Fund for Waters and Sanitation for the last 10 years. And we have been doing so, trying to strengthen institutions and as well to go hand in hand with public policies. So now I would like to say, and I would like to present here an example, especially of a country where we are trying to focus on this project that we are developing together with the Ministry of Environment and Waters in Bolivia. And we are trying in this joint project to create a special strategy for water and sanitation, and especially in implementing these gender policies, as well as the plant and wastewater treatment plants, in which you deal with the problem of treatment of waters in a very integral manner. To the SDGs of Hunger Zero, which is something very fundamental, especially for Spanish cooperation. And here the treatment of water is very important to try to fulfill the compliance of SDGs, especially to implement Agenda 2030 as a reality. Our Arctic SDGs number 2 and 6 access to drinkable water and sanitation. But as well, we have to mention number 17, in which we work on the alliance and to try to introduce the different stakeholders for the collaboration in Spain, and not only with public administrations, but as well with private companies, the academia, and the unions and SMEs, in order to develop new options for jobs, access to new employment, dignified employment, and especially to have access to water. And in this sense, from the Spanish cooperation viewpoint, I think that a good practice, and it was mentioned by the representative of the European Community, we had the Euroclimate Plus, a good project in which we have the option of participating in order to fight against climate change with different stakeholders and the different members of the European Union, the funding of the Commission, and a direct cooperation of Latin American countries and Caribbean countries. Simply, I would like to finish my presentation in this inaugural act to wish you a very successful and fruitful results and conclusions, because we really think that all the experiences and the projects that you're going to deal with are very, very important for international collaboration plus development, and especially to do it in a more efficient manner. So we are going to follow very much, very close the development of all your debates, all your talks, and I am fully convinced that this is going to be so. So I would like to congratulate you for organizing this initiative, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aina. And now I would like to give the floor to María Dolores Ocaña, Undersecretary from the Spanish Ministry for Agriculture, Fisheries, and Food. You have the floor, ma'am. Hello, good morning to everybody. Representative of the AECID, all the representatives from the World Water Council, representatives of the WASAG, and I would like to welcome you here on behalf of the Ministry in Madrid. It is a great honor to organize this international symposium with FAO and as well with the AECID, the Cooperation Ministry here in Madrid. I really hope that these people, that all of you that you are coming here to Spain, you will be able to enjoy this environment, to enjoy the city, and to exchange experiences, and to try to learn something of a topic which is a very, very important at an international level, as is the use of non-conventional waters. We are all very much aware that the scarcity in water supply is one of the basic problems for the development of our society, for counteracting fight against poverty and against disease throughout the world. And as everybody has mentioned, we think this is going to be a growing problem. We have a problem of increased demand and supply at the household level, the domestic use, and the use of all the different sectors, and especially in the agricultural sector. We are very much aware from the Spanish administration the availability of fresh water and the use of water resources is something that we do not have to forget. as it has already been mentioned by René, and you gave the example of Morocco here in Spain. In the southern part of Spain, we have a very unpredictable weather conditions, but we have a food industry which is a leader at an international market. So therefore, we think that it is of utmost importance to deal with the possibility of treating and to use non-conventional waters, especially for reaching its environmental culture. The ministry that I represent, I'm going to focus in irrigated land, which is one of the basic resources. Spain is one of the most important countries with 3.8 million hectares, which represents 22% of irrigated land, and 52% is done through specific irrigation systems. And as we're very much aware of the problems of climate change, we know that the development of our policies as far as irrigation land will be very much implemented through the different international commitments and with our look towards the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement. I would like to remind you that we already have many use of waters, of reclaimed waters and reused waters, and this enables us to incorporate new potential flows of waters. So where do we have these non-conventional resources, especially in the Segura Basin, in the Canary Islands, in the Balearic Islands, in the Júcar, and as well in Ceuta and Melilla with desalinated water. Of course, we have an average rainfall of 30 millimeters years, as René Castro just mentioned. These are areas in which this rainfall is normally fallen in a very specific and very concentrated in time. So in these circumstances, the use of non-conventional waters in the agriculture scenario, we use 1.9% of the total water used in the Spanish irrigated land, which is 70% of waters that they come from superficial source and 23.1% of underwater origin. So here we have to mention the 57,000 hectares of reclaimed waters and the 20,500 desalinated waters. So from our ministry, Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, we really think that we have to contribute to counteract the increase of population and the generation of employment and added value in the rural environment. So this is why in the ministry we are going to continue focusing on this, and we will have to foster new technologies in these irrigated zones, and we include the non-conventional waters. This innovation is already being financed by many of new technologies within the national program of rural development, and we see an environment of irrigated land in which the agriculture sector represented an 80% of the total water consumed in Spain, with 15,000 hectares, cubic hectares a year, and this has increased in 65%. Of course that we have to improve these figures, but it is obvious that we are playing an important part here. Nevertheless, we have to know that there is this huge problem of climate change, water scarcity, and an increasing demand of foodstuff. So all the strategy of modernization of irrigated lands together with the growth of non-conventional resources, of water resources, and biodiversity, land and water, we have to manage a balance into a sustainable intensification and especially the food quality and the mitigation of the effects of climate change. We think this is very important from the strategic viewpoint for our country, and this is totally involved in the whole framework of our policies in trying to fight against climate change, in the demographic challenge, and in the agro-food policies, and as well in the sustainable development of rural areas. Therefore, I would like to thank Danielle, René, for your presentation, and especially for thinking about women in every culture. And in Spain, we are focusing very much in the empowerment of women and to try to be included in all the policies at a horizontal level within all the ministries. And although I didn't imagine that I was going to say so now, but we are fostering very much the empowerment of women in all the different levels of the public policies, and we are focused in this idea that I really think that women have a very, very active role in innovation. Perhaps in Spain, a consolidated democracy, we have guaranteed equal standing by law, and in the rural world, I have to confess that it still is a challenge, the fact that women would assume important roles, and in innovation, women are very much present, and in this innovation idea, women are empowered, and it is very important in our ministry. We grant special prizes of women in the rural area, and the results are very successful, and they're showing what is the track to follow, because obviously at a worldwide level, we all have to continue on that direction. So I thank very much for your comment. Hopefully we will continue on this track, that we are fully committed, and we are very much in the use of non-conventional waters, to continue with the SDGs of reaching hunger zero, and to achieve all the rest of the SDGs, and to continue with the Agenda 2030. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here present.
Muchas gracias, María.
Thank you very much, Maria. And now to finish with this new this session this morning, we are going to proceed to the inaugural presentation of the Executive Director of the International Association of Water, YWA, Mr. Professor Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy, has a huge experience working with the World Bank, with the UNESCO. So, Professor, you have the
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the kind invitation, particularly to Sasha, for inviting me to be here. I come from the IWA, the International Water Association, and it's really an association that focuses on predominantly urban water issues. And I wanted to share with you some of the ways we've been thinking about alternative water sources and how we've managed it. And I think there are a lot of parallels with what's being discussed today. when we think about the way in which the water sector is moving, because of all the global change pressures that we face, we're trying to get smarter. And if you look at the SDGs themselves, they're encouraging the water sector to think in that way. And in the urban water sector, we think of smart in 2 or 3 different ways. And I think it's very relevant also for the agricultural sector. So we're looking at designing our systems more smartly. We're looking at the deployment of more advanced technologies, but I think one of the major areas you see innovation is in how we deal with uncertainty. We know that global change has inherent uncertainties associated with it. So we're trying to create systems that have much more adaptive capacity and can change over time. And in this respect, we're moving to sort of more distributed approaches. We also think about the smart use of our resources, and so we're trying to do more with less. So the way in which we use the water, we're trying to understand better how we can maximize the productivity of that water, and can we use that water multiple times, and can we use different types of water for different types of applications. And then you've got a lot of innovation taking place in the digital space. And we feel that the deployment of more digital technologies, particularly sensors and sort of data-driven analytical machines, is going to allow us to do the other 2 things, the design and the use, in a much more effective way. So we see digital very much as an enabler to allow us to manage our systems in a much more effective way. When you look at the urban water sector, we've learned a little bit from the agricultural sector in that we are starting to now think about the productive use of water. We're asking ourselves, what is it we want the water to do for us? And how do we match the quantity and the quality of the water to that intended use? So we're shifting from this notion that we have to use high-quality drinking water for everything, and we're recognizing that some practices that we have can use marginal quality waters if we use them in a very sort of, well thought out way. So this productive use of water has really changed a lot of what we're doing, and you see the development of technologies that are allowing us to create what we call designer waters. You can see on this side from the West Basin Initiative in Los Angeles, where people are producing waters of different grades using plug-and-play membrane technologies, one quality for irrigation, another quality for artificial aquifer recharge, other qualities for industrial uses. So it's really trying to understand what is the required quality of these different users and then matching that quality for that use. We also see research taking place around things like how we can use forward osmosis to treat our wastewater, but at the same time that forward osmosis dilutes seawater and therefore reduces the cost of desalination when we do that using reverse osmosis. So this idea that the used water has this potential is something that you're seeing. I think the major change that you see, however, is the way in which we view the water cycle. We're starting to have a much more integrated perspective around the water cycle. And we're looking at all water flows that take place within that water cycle. And we're recognizing that all of these waters are good waters. They're just waters of different grades. And what we're starting to do is we're understanding, the way in which the water is being brought, how that water is being utilized, and then what we do with the water once it's used. And what we're trying to do is to sort of optimize at each of these levels, but it's only through this integrated approach that it allows us to do this. So, for example, if I want to produce more drinking water, rather than extracting more surface water from afar, I can invest in efficiencies, in reducing my losses, in conserving water at the households. Again, a lot of parallels with the agricultural sector. If I want to wash my car or irrigate, then I can use some of the marginal waters that I have, like my black water or grey water after treatment. And here you see a lot of parallels. So if you think about what the agricultural sector is doing, it's looking at these alternative sources, this desal, this brackish groundwater, rainwater harvesting. It's trying to look at these marginal waters and see what the opportunities are. In your case, it would be, again, reclaimed water, but also sort of agricultural drainage water and how you might utilize that. But one of the major areas that we work in our sector is really understanding efficiency gains from within the way we use water. And here, I think the opportunities to sort of think about how you optimize crop yield, how you look at nutrient management, soil fertility, and water management in order to get the biggest bang for your buck from the water sector from the water that you're applying is also very important. So if we come back to this sort of integrated perspective, what we see appearing now in terms of the way in which we're viewing the water cycle is the development of integrated sort of modeling tools. And really, we're recognizing that what we're dealing with is a system of systems. And so we're starting to develop these integrated tools that allow us to connect the dots. It allows us to connect these different flows with different types of uses. It allows us to do water balancing. And these are quite simple models that sort of are water flow and contaminants flux models. But now we're starting to use digital ledgers where we're modeling packets of water as they move through the system. And these packets of water have a signature. That signature is the quantity and the quality of the water, but also the effort that it's taken to produce that water, both in terms of energy and in terms of chemicals, etc. So what we're able to do is by understanding these different packets, we can decide where we move the water around the system. This is an example from Nairobi, and I have a colleague here from Nairobi, and this is where water was very scarce. And the natural solution for the city was really to rely on sort of the traditional conventional sources to meet the growing demand. The length of these boxes are quantities and the heights are the unit cost. So their solution was, let's go further and let's find some more surface water and let's bring it to the city. But by applying these tools, we were able to develop a portfolio of solutions which involved efficiency activities, but at the same time looking at alternative sources. And you can see that the unit costs of the water came down because of that. But more importantly, the fact that we had this portfolio of solutions, it gave us security. We had security through diversity. We were not depending only on one source, but we were depending on a diversity of sources. And as you start looking at sort of more exotic types of uses, like, say, black water or localized rainwater harvesting, the costs start to go up. And so it's these models that allow you to understand where the biggest opportunities are for you in terms of trying to develop solutions that allow you to balance your needs with the types of different sources that you have. This is an example from Singapore, which is very clever in the way that it tries to use multiple sources, but the unconventional sources are still around 17 times more expensive than our conventional sources. So if you look at the energy costs to produce, say, our conventional water sources, it's about 0.4 kilowatts per kilowatt hour per meter cube. But once you start looking at reclaimed water, which is the treated wastewater, the problem we have here is the recovery rates are still relatively, well, they're around sort of 70%. But when we start looking at desal, then the thing becomes a little bit more expensive. But that's not to say that's where the solution's going to lie, because the research that's going on in the area of desalination is huge. You've got a lot of innovations, and what makes desalination very attractive is its scalability. The fact that you can, have it at point of use, but you can also have it for large cities, and you can keep adding modules and sort of incrementally building your capacity up. But you see innovations in, for example, biomimicry, so the use of proteins and sort of, coating membranes with proteins. And these proteins, these aquaporins, have a natural, they're osmoregulation systems for living organisms. They have this natural way of avoiding contaminants passing through the membrane, but they also have a hydrophobic nature, which pushes water, so the fluxes are higher, and the energy required is much less. And here you can see that a lot of investment is going into the development of membrane technologies, primarily for desalination and water reuse. And the idea is to bring down the cost of desal from about 3.5 kilowatts per meter cubed per hour to about 1, but it's going to take quite a long time to do that, and to try and improve the recovery rates in the reclaimed water, so we can move from about 70% to about 90%. Now, I talked about the urban sector and how we're trying to optimize, but of course we sit within a watershed. And each of the sectors, so the ag sector, the nature-based solutions, they're trying to optimize their own sort of subsystems. But there are lots of interactions that take place between these sectors. And we have to start to develop systems models that understand some of these interactions. as was pointed out, the SDGs is really promoting partnerships. And where we break down here is the fragmentation of the institutions and the lack of working together to really try and understand the benefits that you get if you have a systems view of what you're doing. And so there is this real need for us now to really understand how, at the watershed level, we can really manage our waters effectively using these types of systems-based tools. This is something that was done in a book that was recently published by where I used to work before, EMI, and it was actually a place here in Spain, Llobregat, the delta there in the Barcelona region, and it was really a voluntary type of agreement between farmers and between the city, where farmers would use less surface water during dry periods, which would free that for the city, and the city would provide additional wastewater, which was well treated for the farmers. And you can see that the sort of the benefit ratios or the multiplier effect is somewhere between 3 and 5 if this is done well. Now, this was just treated wastewater being used by farmers, but there were many other things that this water could have been used for, things like sort of seawater intrusion barriers, and also utilized by industry. So the multiplier effect increases. You know, these are really social responsibility sort of business models where you're really trying to manage the amount of water you have effectively and ensure that everybody has access to it. The other big change that we see in our sector is the way in which we view the used water itself. We used to view it as a burden, and we used to be concerned about how we treat it, but now we recognize that there's a lot of things embedded in that water, and we're starting to sort of recognize that there are lots of opportunities from each of these different streams, and that there's a need for us to combine sort of agro-industrial waste with some of the sort of more urban waste in order to maximize the opportunities, for example, for nutrient production or fertilizers, of course energy production, and that sort of reuse of water. So there's a lot of opportunities for, again, a more integrated approach to managing some of the used water streams. And, from the urban water sector, we're starting to view, again, through a holistic lens where the opportunities are for us to extract value. So in terms of energy, there's opportunities upstream in the drinking water cycle, but then also in the used water cycle through, the heat in the sewers, but also the generation of electricity either through biogas or directly through things like microbial fuel cells. And in nutrient recovery, we see opportunities on site, so where you have septic tanks and fecal sludge, where you can generate nutrients, but at the centralized scale as well, there's a lot of opportunities to generate nutrients. And there are some very good examples, and it's cited, there's a very good book published by EMI called Resource Recovery and Reuse, and they have some very, very good examples of how you're utilizing these different waste streams to create value. And this is in Jordan, where elevation allows us to have turbines to generate electricity as the wastewater flows from upstream downstream. We then generate electricity locally at the treatment works itself through biogas production. And then there's soil conditioners that are generated, and then a large amount of that water is used for agricultural purposes. This is another example in Peru where wastewater is being treated using duckweed or any other phytoremediation process, and that duckweed is then being used as a food input to grow fish. Those fish are being sold, and that generates a lot of value, and also it supports food security. So there are some very interesting approaches to how to do this, but the challenge is really understanding the business models. We're very good at predicting how much we can generate, how much nutrients or how much water or how much energy we can actually generate, but we don't really understand, the business models that are going to sustain that operation. So the first thing is, who are our customers for these products? So if I'm generating nutrients, is it farmers or is it fertilizer companies that are going to buy my fertilizer? Then what is my value proposition? Why would they buy from me and not from somebody else? Is it because my product is cheaper? Is it because it's more effective? Is it because it's greener? And then what is the cost structure involved? How much does it cost me to take that value proposition to these different customer segments? And is there money to be made? And you will find that in many of these resource recovery schemes, it's currently not really financially very viable. They're still very much in the sort of innovative cycle, startup sort of state, and they depend a lot on risk capital. This is an example of where struvite is being precipitated out of a wastewater treatment works. And most people believe that the money is being made from the fertilizers that they sell, the struvite. But actually, most of the money that's being made in this process is because they have strong regulations managing nutrient discharges, so there's money being made to prevent pollution. And then, because the struvite is being stripped from the activated sludge lines, if it wasn't stripped, then it creates blockages of the pipes of the return activated sludge line. So there's a big saving in terms of operational maintenance if you strip that phosphorus. So most of the money in this system is being made from operations maintenance in the treatment works and the reduction in nutrient discharge, and only a little is coming from the sale of that fertilizer. But it works, but it's context specific. Similarly, this is, the production of pellets from fecal sludge for fertilizers as well. Again, most of the money here is made from the fact that they are providing a service to the utility, and that is managing their nutrient discharge consent, rather than the money they make from the pellets. So we have to understand those contexts. Now, what you see within our sector, it's quite interesting that this view about productive use and this sort of trying to capture value from the waste streams is changing the language in the water sector. We're now moving away from water treatment to wastewater treatment, and we're starting to think about water machines, where we get these different grades of water. Some of it's unused water, some of it's used water. We put them into this machine and we turn the handle, and this machine can produce these different grades of water for different uses. And this machine can also generate energy, and this machine can also generate nutrients. And where we locate these devices becomes very important, because the agricultural sector plays a very important role in supporting some of the products, well, in providing some of the feedstock for this machine, but also utilizing some of the outputs from the machine. And what becomes very important is scale. And you see the sector starting to think much more about decentralized solutions, solutions that meet the demands of somewhere between 30 to 50,000 people. And the beauty of these systems is that they also have this adaptive capacity. I mean, they're small, and water is heavy, so you don't want to move water long distances if you can avoid it, particularly if you're doing the reuse of water. But they also have this adaptive capacity. So as an area grows, you can add modules, and you can grow the system progressively. So you're not locked into sort of centralized systems, but you have systems that, by their nature, are sort of, adaptive. And where we have existing areas, what we would do, if you look at the purple hexagon, it's where we have centralized infrastructure. What we would tend to do is we would extend that centralized infrastructure into the peri-urban areas as the areas grow. But now what we're talking about is ring-fencing the sort of the urban core. And in the peri-urban areas, developing these decentralized units and understanding the rural-urban linkage, the benefits that we get from working both at that peri-urban interface with ag and the urban sector working together. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is the speed at which new ideas are being permeated within our sector. And it's very slow. The water sector is viewed as being very conservative, and it's for very rational reasons. There's risks to public health. We have very tight budgets. There are many upfront costs associated with procuring innovation, and we have to then invest a lot in trained staff. But I think this idea, and this is just an example here, where this is a technology, this is the CANBI process, which is used in wastewater treatment for, it's the thermal hydrolysis process. But what you see is that the original paper was written somewhere around sort of 1978, 1980. And the first sort of system to be deployed was around sort of 20 years later. And really the uptake of this technology was another 10 years later. So it took 30 years from the idea for it actually going into practice. And it's a very slow process. And I think we need to recognize that and think about how we can accelerate the diffusion of some of this innovation. There's also this myth that the water sector, as I said, is very conservative like an elephant. But what we found is that we need to sort of dissect the sector and understand that it's not just elephants. I mean, there are elephants within the water sector, and these are, the large concrete infrastructures that we have, which have very long gestation periods. People think about them for a very long time. And then they have very, very long lifespans. And it's true that the sector does have a lot of elephants. But then there are other things within the sector. There are horses. These are the machines that do things much faster, change the physics of the flows that we have. These have much shorter gestation periods, and they have much shorter lifespans. So their innovation cycles are much quicker. And then you have what we would call the hares, and these have very short gestation periods and very short lifespans. And these are things like our sensors, our digital controls that allow us to do things much better, the stoichiometric control, maximizing energy efficiency. And if we understand that the water sector is not just one homogeneous thing, but it's sort of heterogeneous in this way, we can have the right types of professionals involved in purchasing and procuring this type of technology and being trained in this type of technology, rather than allowing the elephants to control our whole innovation cycle. So what we're doing in IWA is we're trying to sort of push for a much more horizontalization of the technologies that we have, and recognize that you need different types of people working in your hair sector and looking outside the water sector for innovations around sensors and analytics. You have a different type of group of people working with your horses, and again, procuring this type of technology from outside the water sector and recognizing that innovation is much faster in that. And then you have your elephants, right? And you really use the first two, your horses and your hares, to repurpose some of this concrete infrastructure you have. And what we see, particularly in the emerging economies in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, this avoidance now of investing in large centralized infrastructure, avoiding investing in the elephants, and trying to create systems that have much shorter lifespans, so that as technology moves ahead, they can change that technology. And in a way, the key, and this is what IWA does, is we try to bridge this chasm. We have, the really sort of nerdy type of researchers who sit in labs and you don't let them out. We have the hardcore practitioners at the other end who are not really interested in innovation, that are just deploying it. But in the middle, we have researchers who have 1 foot in practice, and we have practitioners that have 1 foot in research. And those people, if we can identify the opinion leaders in that group, we can get them to accelerate the diffusion of innovation. And because we're a network organization, we are systematically trying to do that. And we have an innovation platform that really is trying to accelerate the uptake of these new ideas. I always end with this slide, all my presentations, and it's just to say that, I think that we can't stay in the business as usual lane, because global change is making that very difficult, particularly the numbers of people that are going to be on this planet, coupled with issues of water associated with climate change. I think where we are now is we're tinkering. We're trying harder. We're trying to optimize relatively bad systems, but the headroom is limited. There's only a limit to what we can do to optimize these bad systems. So we do need a sort of a paradigm shift where we are thinking in this sort of smart way, where we create systems that are adaptive, they can change with time. We rethink the way in which we use water and reuse water. And we use some of this innovation, particularly in the digital space, as an enabler to allow us to do those things. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor, for this very interesting presentation. Y con esta presentación hemos llegado al final del...
This brings us to the end of the first part of the morning. I'm going to now ask you to enjoy a cup of coffee at the back of the room. We have coffee. At 1100, we reconvene. My colleague Sasha Ku-Oshima will be moderating, and to all of you, my thanks.
I think what happened to my... Heba Ahmed from the World Bank. Do we have Ms. Heba Ahmed here? Please come. Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're refreshed and ready to welcome our first technical session, Achieving the SDGs and How to Make It Happen. I am Sasha Kuoshima. I'm the Deputy Director of FAO Land and Water Division, and delighted to welcome you all, our distinguished panelists, as well as many of our partners and colleagues in the audience today. We care deeply about the essential issue of food security as well as water security. And before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I'd like to briefly mention some of the work that we do at the FAO Land and Water Division, where our mission is to enhance agriculture productivity under the sustainable use of land and water resources. We have a team here who worked very hard in bringing this symposium to fruition with our Spanish counterpart, MAPA. And I'd like to mention, besides the WASAG, platform in which we have been hosting since the inception. We have been involved in the water reuse dialogue for over a decade. In the past, we have produced the guidelines for the safe reuse of wastewater in agriculture as well as aquaculture, working with the WHO and many others who are in the room with us today. We also have developed the desalination discussion paper, looking at the economic, environmental, and technological feasibilities of desalination for agriculture purposes. And Spain was heavily featured in that paper with a lot of great experiences and cost figures for high-value cash crops that can be used for desalinated water. Both FAO and MAPA have structured and designed this 2 days of symposium with many speakers from around the world and represented also by women. We have many women, female panels, and also you will see youth panels as well as farmer organizations here. And we are bringing them here to discuss and identify effective and coordinated governance aimed at efficiency, economic efficiency, social equity, and environmental sustainability wrapped around the 3 main themes of this symposium, which are 1, policy, 2 is finance, and the 3rd is technology and innovations. So without much ado, I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists for session 1, How to Make It Happen. The first speaker is Mr. Shoni Goldberger, head of the Jerusalem district from Ministry of Environment of Israel. And then we have Claudio Bacci-Galuppi, head of water sector, the European Union DEVCO, which stands for the Directorate of International Cooperation and Development. We have Ms. Teresa Navarro, Director of Water Sustainability from University of Murcia, Spain, and Ms. Heba Ahmed, welcome, Water Resources and Irrigation Specialist from the World Bank in Egypt. You came from Egypt today. And then Mr. Oriol Bello, Head of Projects Department at Suez Agriculture Technology Innovation, also located in Spain. Ms. Valeria Silvestri, our Senior Water Management and Rural Infrastructure Expert from the International Fund for Agriculture Development in Rome, Italy, our sister Rome-based agency. And finally, but not least, Ms. Maria Lahore, the Principal Executive from the Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, CAF, based in Spain. Now, I would like to pose one question, actually 2 questions in total, to the panelists to address in 5 minutes, since we have a large panelist, to answer the first question before I ask you the second question, and I will hold the Q&A if we have the time at the very end. So first, I would like to ask you all to please introduce yourself first and briefly describe your area of work within your organization or country in how you make non-conventional water use in agriculture happen to achieve the SDGs. So you can address it in the context of a private sector or government organization or international fund. So I welcome Mr. Shoni Goldberger to go first.
Okay. Good morning, you all. I'm Shoni Goldberger. I'm from the Ministry of Environmental in Israel. And I'm heading the Jerusalem district, but we deal with different issues all over the country. And in short, I can say that I deal with any concept of environment in my area. And what I wanted to talk about is, as Sasha mentioned, in a few, can I get the slides? Oh. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about is how we took a crisis for a real opportunity. The system of water in Israel, we have actually, you can see, I don't know if you can see the numbers, but the natural water refill is about half of the water consumption in Israel. And this actually problem is enhanced because of population growth in Israel, which is unique in a developed country. It's about 2% a year, and it's still growing.
And you can see that in the last 50, 60 years, the population grew from 2 to about 8.5, almost 9 million people now, and it's still growing. So we need to actually do something about the growing demand for water. And what we did is we started an integrated water resource management with the goal of sustainable supply to the water demand by manufacturing non-conventional water and allocation of the treated wastewater to agriculture. So this is like a national goal. And what we did, okay, sorry. What we did is actually to stand for the challenge, we started to build infrastructure all over Israel, many waste water treatment plants. With you can see that the wastewater in Israel is more than 500 million cubic meters, and about almost all of it, like 99% is collected, 93% is treated. And the thing is that the treatment is now going towards a tertiary treatment. About half is already tertiary, the other half is the secondary. It's important because tertiary is, it can be used for irrigation almost without a limit. And the secondary, you've got a limit. Not everything you can irrigate with secondary. So the goal is to make in a few years everything to the level of tertiary. And we use now like about 86, and it's growing also 86%, which is, I think, the largest number that you have everywhere. And you can see the new water supply in Israel by resources. And the big change is that natural potable water is about half as it used to be the last 20 years ago. And we have a lot of reclaimed effluent and also major desalination, about the same size of the reclaimed effluent, about a little over 500 million cubic meters. Just to finish, I want to say that in the integrated water resource management that we are doing, we have also a very strong regulation and new legislation. We set standards for more than about 37 different parameters in the water. The principle that we works accordingly is that all customers should pay for the water they use. We needed, and still we think we will need large investments in infrastructure, and government loans can help for that. And we also got, especially in the last 20 years, we have good inspection and efficient enforcement that made it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shoni. This is very important. Israel's experience in this area is enormous contribution. Then I'd like to invite Claudio Bacigalupi for your reflections from the EU.
Thanks. Hello? Yes. Well, first of all, thanks for organizing this event to FAO and the Spanish government. I'm Claudio Bacigalupi. I'm the head of the Water and Sanitation sector at the Development Cooperation Directorate in Brussels. But let me, before starting my speech, I wanted to ask you if you know which is the oldest body, juridical body in Europe that is still working. It's a question that nobody, or most probably not only the Spanish knows, because it's the Tribunal de Agua de Valencia. It's the oldest body in Europe that deals with water in juridical terms, and it's all coming from the 11th century, that witnessed also in Europe why the question of water has always been absolutely centric in every activity, in economic activities. So, having said this, what we do in DevCo is in my directorate is to basically manage and mainstream water and sanitation issues around the globe, so from Latin America, Asia, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, and having an understanding on what concerns water. Because water, it's, I was 2 days ago in a very interesting discussion at political level on the value of water, because we don't have to forget another dimension on water that has not been mentioned today, because it's a political question. Water, especially in Africa, it's shared. It's not depending on the volunteer of a country or of a city. In 90% of the African waters, but it's also valid in Asia, in Latin America, are shared waters. Are waters that are international waters, and for being international water, they need to be treated at international level. That's why we have in DEFCO 2 main, let's say, discussion, one at political level and in the other one at technical level. So at political level, we are stressing the point that transboundary water cooperation is a need. When countries are developing their activities in industrial sector, in the agricultural sector, at urban level, most of the countries are using water that has been used before, or that in any case has crossed other countries or other regions in the same countries, like the case in Brazil or Argentina, where there are provinces that are independent from the use of waters, and that need to be translated into common agreements, political agreements that then lately are transformed into technical agreements, if you want. So this is a very important part that we are stressing enormously. We are promoting, for instance, the use of water conventions, the UN system, the UNECE water conventions from '92, where are establishing, let's say, the rules on how to use transboundary waters. So how to agree between countries on the use of transboundary waters. And this is extremely important, because otherwise countries do not match the needs of one another, and those use can create conflicts. Just to mention a case, the Nile or the Mekong, or there are cases everywhere. I mean, just having my colleague on my right in the Middle East, the water, it's extremely important, it's fundamental, and it's cause also of tension, political tensions, because the technical are almost always transferred to the political dimension. So this is something that we are doing. The other one, it's very linked to what has been already mentioned, the nexus, so the efficiency in the use of water in development activities. So the nexus between energy, water, and food security, which is extremely related to what we are discussing today. And then, obviously, the Commission has several tools to implement that, from budget support to normal development activities, or to blending finance, for instance, which will be an argument of discussion today, which is how to maximize the use of the Commission normally provides grant money, so how to mix grant money with loans coming from financial institutions like my colleagues here in the panel, that are meant to help let's say the implementation of infrastructure, or in any case investments in the water and sanitation sector. This is done at local level by our more than 140 delegations, but then it's assessed and politically let's say put in a coherence with the global policy on water and sanitation in Brussels, where I work. So I think that the minute was okay. I think I can stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your reflections, Claudio. Then I would like to invite Professor Teresa Navarro to say a few words.
En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias a los organizadores, tanto la FAO como el Gobierno de España, por haberme dado la oportunidad de estar aquí.
Thank you for having invited me to speak here on behalf of a small university, a regional one, and in a region such as Murcia, which ever since always, we can say, suffers the scarcity of this vital element. I have fought to see how we can, or how it is possible to really leverage these resources, especially because the land is very fertile, very productive. The region of Murcia produces 2.5 million tons of vegetables and fruit per year. So there we are, without resources, but tremendously productive in agro terms. I teach at the University of Murcia. I focus on sustainability as a full professor, and I'm secretary of the Institute of Water. So I am here on my academic credentials. And I think this is important also because we study, we research, we carry out transfer of knowledge, and we also establish a relationship between the public powers and the private sector. So here we're talking about non-conventional resources. It's absolutely essential. We have to overcome very many barriers regarding the consumption of products, for instance, which are products that are consumed as fresh, but which have been irrigated, so where non-conventional resources have been used for them. So I'd like to just underscore the fact that we have been researching in this field to overcome the challenge of managing these scarce resources as efficiently as possible. And let me add something to what my distinguished colleagues have said. In Murcia, in the region, water as a resource is so important, and our sector is so important that together with the Tribunal de las Aguas de Valencia, we have a similar entity, which is the Council of Good Men, which is acknowledged as a court, as I say, in charge of hearing ever since centuries ago on the arguments that are the result of non-agreements being reached about water use between and among different farmers. So we have that tradition. Irrigation in the region of Murcia, if we speak about traditional irrigation, it is traditional. We go all the way back to Roman times. And therefore, there's no doubt that at the university, we've always focused very much on our heritage, and we have studied it. We have provided our expertise to the public authorities with regards reuse, for instance, and Murcia developed in the year 2000 the sanitation plan. And at this point in time, the reuse of water is very important. 98% of the population has guaranteed treatment, and that water is reused. So I think it's fair to say that the academic contributions with regards our studies and our knowledge and our relationship with society is, I think, an important role indeed.
Thank you very much. I think that's very important to have the view from the academia, and I'd like to now ask Ms. Eba Ahmed from the World Bank for your reflections.
My name is Eba Ahmed, and I'm a water resource and irrigation specialist with the World Bank. I'm based in Cairo. However, I work on regional projects that covers the Middle East and North Africa region. Currently, as the bank, we provide loans and technical assistance for countries in the region, given the challenges that our colleagues mentioned here around shared water resources, population increase, which exhibits more stress on water, economic expansion, and so on. So the bank actually is working in the countries to help them in providing, for example, if we're speaking about non-conventional solutions, in Egypt we have a 1 billion program that stems from the reuse of wastewater. This is the whole goal, and however, it provides as well the service delivery. And we're pushing governments now towards maximizing finance for development. And basically, this is to free up the public sector financing and to decrease the liabilities on the governments. A good example on that is Asmara blended financing in Jordan. In Egypt as well, we are helping in modernization of irrigation through providing technical assistance and getting the global knowledge around that transferred to the government. What we see as important in moving this agenda forward is political will and the support from the government, institution, and the regulation that we try to support whenever there is, for example, private sector is not able to operate in one country. We try to provide DPFs to look at policy and regulations and try to support the countries in that. Currently, we're discussing, we have DPF in Jordan, and we have good models in Morocco, as well as the on the regulatory. We're trying, for example, in Egypt, we're trying to help the companies in utilities to strive for the credit worthiness, which will eventually get them to the commercial market and to the private sector participation. So this is what we have.
From the private sector, Suez, a champion in the world. How can you bring this more to other developing world? We welcome your reflections.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you to the FAO and to MAPA for organizing this event and inviting us. As it has been said, we will try to represent, let's say, the private operator delegated by the legal entities and authorities. We are present in 80 countries in the world, so you can imagine very different cases of wastewater reuse. I will try to focus in the Spain case and Latin America because of maybe the auditory. In Spain, it has been already said that, but I will try to reinforce the message of the ministry, because only 2 countries in the world are either in the 2 classifications as wastewater being reused as a volume and percentage of the wastewater being reused, and those are Israel and Spain. In Spain, we are reusing around 1 million cubic meter per day, which is the equivalent of a big city of 5 million people, so you can imagine the size. And at the same time, there we are top 5, and at the same time, this represents 20% of the wastewater being treated. It's not Israel with the 86% that the colleagues show us, but it's still top 5 of the world. From this first framework, as it has been said already by the colleague in Murcia, 90% of these wastewater reclamation experiences are in the Mediterranean basin. So Catalonia, Valencia, Murcia, and Andalusia. Those are the experiences that started maybe in the early 80s, even before any European directive or framework pushed mainly by the tourism pressure on coastal qualities and by added value crops growth initiatives, because as it's known, Spain is the leading export market in Europe. From this, let's say, this reuse market, we as Suez, we are leading around 30% of these experiences. So we are reusing around 100 million cubic meter per year only in Spain. This helps us to achieve our commitment with sustainable development goals. Not only number 2, which is zero hunger, that is kind of the subtitle of this round table, but we don't want to forget also commitment with number 6, with this clean water and sanitation. Number 13, which is climate action. We achieved last year a 70% reduction in greenhouse effect gases emission in our wastewater treatment plants. Like Professor said, sometimes many of the reclamation or reuse projects are driven by reduction in operation expenses of the operator, which adds to the nexus water, energy, and food as well. I don't want to forget, because the title is water, and again, Professor Kalanithy spoke about biofertilizers, because we are reusing 1 million cubic meter per year, as I said, but we are reusing also in Spain 150 of tons of biofertilizers for agriculture. And when we add Latin America, for example, our experience in Chile, what we call biofactories, we have in our pachydermic sector, we have already adopted the word biofactories. We are treating and reusing, again, 150,000 tons per year, also in Chile. This from the operator point of view. I want to start also a discussion. When we looked at from, I am in a subsidiary that's called Suez Agriculture. When we look at that from an agriculture point of view, those impressive figures are less impressive. Why? Because with our firepower that I have described, we can only reach 10 to 15,000 of hectares in Spain. This is roughly 0.5% of the Spanish irrigation land. So when we look from the water point of view, it's a nice experience. When we look from the agriculture point of view, it's a drop in the ocean. Regarding technologies, I will not say much because also Professor has said all the portfolio of technologies, but I will enlighten just one point. For us, the innovation in the 21st century in reclaim and wastewater has to come from digitalization. This is the tools that we are implementing because when you take a look at the slide of Professor Kalanithy, we normally say that water sector is not rocket science, but when you take a look at some of the slides, it begins to be rocket science. When you have to match the cross flows of agriculture, urban, wastewater, green water, you cannot afford a proper smart management of these complex systems without digitalization. We have developed some tools regarding Water Framework Initiative of the European Union, complex algorithm, marginal cost, demand, cost of water, etc. You cannot afford a smart management of this without digitalization of the sector. Thank you.
And you led a good segue for my next question, which I will ask you later. But before that, let me invite Ms. Valeria Silvestri.
Okay. Good morning to all. Good morning, Sasha. Thank you for the invitation. I'm here on behalf of Ms. Turaya Tricky, who is the Director of the Production, Markets and Institution Division of IFAD, and we provide support to all the projects and to all the programs around the 5 continents where IFAD is engaged. So IFAD is a UN agency specialized in smallholder agriculture and in rural development, and we are as well an international financial institution providing governments with the finance needed to make lasting and effective investments in food security and nutrition. In relation to the 2030 agenda, we are especially engaged in reaching SDG 1 and 2, so no poverty and hunger, and also some other SDGs. And in fact, we mainstream some of those, so we have them in all our programs and projects and investments, and these are the mainstreamed ones. We work in gender, climate change and nutrition and youth as well. So IFAD targets the poorest populations and the most vulnerable ones, which are normally engaged in agriculture. In agriculture to provide their subsistence. So some are subsistence farmers. And in agriculture, water is the key entry point to improve the livelihoods of these rural poor people. But demand of water is increasing across all sectors, and the availability of water, or the availability of quality water, of the right quality and quantity, is decreasing. And so there is the risk for these poor smallholder farmers to be left behind. Therefore, investments in water in conventional and unconventional water sources is at the core of many IFAD investments. In fact, in the projects and programs approved during the period 2013 until 2015, more than 10% of IFAD investments were targeted to water, most of them to agricultural water. Really broadly speaking, the objectives pursued are access to water, so to strengthen the access to water of these poor smallholder farmers and rural populations, to strengthen the profitable use of water, to increase the benefits and the market participation of these poor rural people, and in water conservation, so that these investments and these strengthened livelihoods can last in time and be sustainable. We also participate in the WASAG framework, which was introduced this morning by Ms. Danielle Gaillard, so I don't have to introduce it again, and through the person of Mawira Chitima, who is the lead global technical specialist in IFAD of water and rural infrastructure, we participate in the financing mechanism working group of the WASAG framework. And they are developing a framework for unlocking finance in agriculture. And there is a talk about blended finance, which also Mr. Bajikalupi spoke about before. And this financing framework is based on 3 pillars, or better said, on 3 cornerstones, because they are connected. So imagine it as a triangle of these 3 cornerstones, where the first one is, or are the on-the-ground activities implemented by poor rural smallholder farmers. So these on-the-ground activities where IFAD participates normally are agricultural activities, so agriculture, irrigation, drip irrigation, livestock, and, well, the on-the-ground activities implemented by the farmers. To bring the farmers, or to enable them in these activities, there needs to be risk reduction. So it is an uncharted terrain for them, and it is really risky to engage in new technologies and in new ways, for example, unconventional water resources. So there needs to be a risk reduction strategy, with this the second cornerstone of this framework. And last but not least at all is the financial support mechanism. So there has to be financing to implement these activities and the risk-sharing tools, which are normally insurances or guarantee mechanisms. Everything has to be really fine-tuned and targeted, because we have to look at the rural population, who is the target group, what is their problems, what are their surroundings, what environment are they in, because we can't give them the latest and most technology for their irrigation if before they were working with rain-fed irrigation. So the fine-tuning of these 3 cornerstones is very important to us to benefit smallholder farmers.
Then I'd like to invite Ms. Maria Lahore from CAF.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you, Fao. I'm going to switch to Spanish because I'm Spanish, so I find a little bit weird to be speaking in English here. So, voy a hablar en español. Muchas gracias a la organización. Muchas gracias.
Very much to the organization, to FAO, for having invited the CAF to participate in this seminar, and representing, for those of you that you don't know, is the Inter-American Development Bank, Spain and Portugal. That is why I work and I represent here CAF, is investing infrastructure as a road network, airports, energetic systems, and lately we are working very much in the water resources portfolio, and we are one of the financing, especially with a portfolio of $3 billion on the loans in water and sanitation. And this shows basically how important this has been given by all the countries. When you speak about Latin America, and here you have mentioned Middle East, African countries, but in Latin America, it's not a region that you can name all the countries. It's not a good area for water resources and for water facilities, etc. etc. The problem and the important challenges of Latin America, that although we do have water, is not well distributed. In Peru, for example, water is concentrated in the eastern part of the country, whereas most of the population in agriculture is in the coastal areas. So very often, to try to reach SDGs number 6 especially, and the effort in Latin America in water resources is to try to how to reach the areas where they do not have water available in order to respond to the demand of water. And Latin America, it's not without considering the increase of agricultural demand, the depopulation, the climate change, all the important challenges. 5% of the GDP is held by agricultural sector in Latin America, and it consumes 50% of water. So I consider that 70% of the agricultural population has to increase, and this represents important resources. And this is why CAF, the CAF, is working to help them with this. We are working with the countries and forming groups of basins and trying to do in an integral manner all these resources. CAF has been working with the World Bank in the manufacturing, in a special guide on circular economy, and to favor those countries that are in need. And in the second point is especially to focus on those barriers in order to overcome the challenges for water. So I would like to mention the constraints that we have on the lack of legislative framework. For example, in Costa Rica, when you mention water treatment systems, they already consider that they have it. And we're speaking about fresh water, and there is a lack of awareness in those countries in order to realize that the circular economy has to be part of the solution. Here we are working together with many countries in public policies, implementing some sort of leadership in specific projects. We've brought many steering committees to Murcia, focusing in the agricultural sector. And as far as the financing on the use of non-conventional waters, we are implementing a project in Venezuela on the harvesting of rainwater, and we have a portfolio of $500 million. And we are trying to do a study as well, implementing a study on trying to find out what are the best technologies and to try to see the best solutions for a more efficient, the best efficiency for non-agricultural. And I think, as you gave me 1 minute, I think that is all basically.
My next question to you all is, if you were to identify one intervention or even a couple, what are the promising opportunities in optimizing non-conventional water use in agriculture? And what advice would you give to FDA in scaling it up globally? Shoni, back to you.
Okay, not an easy question. First of all, I think that when you talk about non-conventional water and the use, especially what I talked about is wastewater, treated wastewater. As an environmentalist for the last 25 years, there is no way of doing nothing. I mean, both ways. The pollution is a big problem, and it's much more expensive to clean or to try to clean an aquifer than to not pollute it. So this is my perspective. But I think that every country or region should have an integrated water resource management. And it's very important, and I'd say now what I wanted to say in my last sentence, which is you have to make this program a custom-made suit for every region. It couldn't be just a copy of a good plan that worked somewhere else. Most of the things were mentioned already, but there are a few guidelines that are very important, I think, for the water resource management. I think you have to have very good regulation. If you don't have a good regulation, you cannot actually make good investments in infrastructure. You don't have stability. If you do have legislation and you set the parameters that you want to get, you can get international investments. A waste water treatment plant is a very long-term stable investment if you got the strong regulation. So I think this is a point to remember. The principle that we use in Israel, that customers or the users should pay for the water, is also important. I know it's a problem in some areas, but I think the idea is important. And what you get in return is very important also, especially for agriculture. You get stability in quantity and also in quality of the water. I just think of drought years and growing populations and growing pollution still. Another thing that was already mentioned, but is very important also for us in Israel, is new technologies. We work on it all the time. We've made vast investments in saving water. You know, the drip irrigation, but there are other fields that we're working on. Also treating sewage and desalination are becoming cheaper in time because of good technologies and good management. Of course, the computerized systems are getting also much more efficient. And I guess that's all. The custom-made suit in every region. This is for a good integrated water resource management. That's what I want to emphasize.
Thank you. Mario?
Thanks, Sasha. Unfortunately, I have to restart from policy and political environment to understand then from the technical point of view what we have in mind. So you basically, all of you, or mostly the European, knows in which political situation we are in Europe. We are waiting for the new European Commission to be let's say, accepted by the European Parliament after the elections. But nevertheless, that should happen in the 1st of December, so it's just a small waiting. But for the time being, the elected president of the Commission, Mrs. van der Leyen, has already said and made something in terms of what will happen in the next year at European level, but also in the external action, which is where I work. So the president of the Commission has announced the priorities, what will be important in the next years for the European Union, and I have to read it. So there is a first pillar, which is the Green Deal. It's something which is very important for us, which is very linked to the use of natural resources and especially water. So this Green Deal basically targets neutral carbon economies in Europe, but also reuse circular economies in Europe. So how to reuse at the best all natural resources. Then there is another priority which is linked to migration, peace and security, which is again very linked to the use of water resources, because from the climate change and the situation in crisis, let's say, regions in the world, are also depending on the availability of water resources and the use of water resources. So again, also in this second priority, that we can see the water issues. Then there is a job creation, which again, it's a European thing, but it's also an external dimension that we need to care about, because the job creation, it's also very much linked to the use of water. So there was the UN Water made some years ago, let's say, an analysis, and basically 1 out of 3 works in the whole economy in the world are depending on water. So water, either from water access, distribution, but then sanitation, it's always present in every activity of human beings. So also in this pillar, it's very present. Then there is another pillar which has been mentioned already. It's digitalization. So digitalization will be a priority of the Commission, either in Europe, but we are also trying to understand how that priority can be translated in development action in less developed countries. And then the last one, the 5th one, is governance. So as has been mentioned before, without governance, obviously, all those priorities are difficult or impossible to be made, as like what I was mentioning before on transboundary water. So, and now I talk about technical issues. So these political priorities, which are indispensable, I mean, you cannot do anything without a political commitment, will need to be translated later on into practice in development action or in activities related to agriculture, but on the use of water in general. And that will be done, for instance, on policy regulatory frameworks, circular economy I've already mentioned, but then sustainable energies, which is also a very important, as mentioned before, issue that has to be addressed on how to better use water when it's the moment of producing energy, which is the second most important sector after agriculture in the water use. And then obviously what is going to be under the urban, it's going to be this sector in the forthcoming decades. In Africa, most of the future 10 and up million cities are not yet known. There are cities which are already grown, but the growing population in Africa is going to explode. And it's really there where the urban situation has not yet been completely developed that we can intervene still. Because when the professor this morning was announcing this complex regulatory framework to reuse and better use water resources, but that need, apart from purely financial mechanism and needs, that needs to be integrated in what exists already. So obviously in great urban agglomeration like, I don't know, Nairobi and others, it's less easy to intervene, while it's much easier, and we still have time to intervene where the system is it's in an embryonal, let's say, moment, and where we can make transformation of the way we are using waters. And I think it's all. Thanks.
Professor Navarro.
Bien, muchas gracias. Bueno, yo creo que el principal objetivo,
Very much. I think that the main objective, or the most important opportunity in a general manner of the use of non-conventional waters, it refers very much to the management and governance of the water resources, and to incorporate these water resources on the management and governance of combined land and water in order to achieve a social and economical sustainable goal. So in the use of non-conventional waters is to incorporate these water resources, the circular economy. It has already been mentioned here, but we have to underline something which is very important at a European level. It has been considered as a priority, and we can mention the wastewater director of 2008, many programs of European Union. There has been one of the priorities, but we have to mention what my colleague has said. It is very important to consider that a circular economy not only represents the use of products products and raw material, and to change the paradigm of a linear economy as if they were limited resources, but infinite. But we have to have them on the resources, and we have to consider this point in a circular economy. And the second, in order to answer to what you mentioned, the use of non-conventional waters, for me, is the legal framework. As my colleague mentioned, in this point, we cannot be very general because we have to go down to the point and to refer to specific countries and specific regions. Spain has a very specific legal framework, regulations of the year 2007, and on the use of water, the different management plans for irrigation. If we have this plan, we can always update it and amend it. We have a proposal of the Commission to the Parliament, and hopefully it will be passed and approved approximately in 6-8 months. That is a new legal framework at a European level that would have influence in the Spanish legislation. And I would like to mention one of the important challenges of these new European regulations. Now it is only focused on water resources for agriculture, but in our regulation, it's the urban, industrial, agricultural, so we have 5. So we will try to incorporate, we are going to increase the Spanish legal framework or legislation according to the European guidelines or regulations, and I think that it will be very much necessary to implement the Spanish system to go a step beyond. And in this matter, I do think that it is very important to think about the possibilities of changing Spanish regulations in order to introduce new concepts. We all know, it has already been mentioned this morning, is to purify and degenerate these reclaimed waters. Refers to high quality, and in Spain, we have to use this opportunity to go a step forward and to incorporate water resources, incorporating a public service, a new group, which is the urban water services, and to organize this as a public service and to go beyond the local level on the supply chain. There are certain areas at a national level and at a European level as well, which is very important to focus on this and to create this public service that would integrate the joint management and joint coordination, not only of treatment, but as well of reuse of non-conventional waters. And I think this is basically what I wanted to mention, answering to your question. Thank you very much.
Reflections from the World Bank, especially in the Near East region?
Yeah, so on the Middle East, on the circular economy, actually moving from solutions, isolated solutions, such as a wastewater treatment plant that serves a locality, to integrated river basin planning and approach, and moving from stringent environmental standards and regulations to more that optimize water resources use and management and promote resource recovery. Innovative technologies is much needed. However, technology alone is insufficient. Regulation is needed in that effect. Awareness, especially on the circular economy, is much needed in our region, as well as empowering institutions and the whole governance issue that our colleagues alluded to. So those are, like, in summary, what we think.
Thank you. From Suez, Bello, Mr. Bello.
Thank you. The figures it's not working?
Yes.
It's working? The figures I gave before about Spain and the Mediterranean basin, there I have good news and bad news. The good news is that those figures have been maintained steady for the last 20 to 25 years. And this is bad news as well. So nearly no further deployment, no new experiences have been experienced in these years. The good news is that no claims have been issued, so the technology works, the risk assessment is controlled, and the framework, it can be improved, but the framework exists. 20 years ago, when I have some teachers here, the worries were technologies, framework, qualities, etc. So there has been a step forward. But to launch these experiences further, we encounter a difficulty that is how to marry offer and demand. And this is distances. This is transportation cost. And we see that in Spain, the best allocations, the best added value crops, and the cheap offer of wastewater have already been taken. So further experience is difficult to expand in our country. Nevertheless, for example, in Latin America, we are seeing nice initiatives which are unfortunately driven a lot by climate change and by human disasters like aquifer deployment, etc. For example, I will highlight some private-to-private initiatives because public subsidies, public aids, agriculture common policies in European are going to reduce. So some farmers, for example, in Mexico, vineyards or added value crops are facing scarcity, and they are launching private initiatives to take wastewater from 90 kilometers away. There you encounter a cost that is nearly the desalination cost. So some projects are launched in an individual way and maybe are not that properly designed. In Peru, like Maria said, we are seeing some closed basins like Ica Valley, where no more groundwater can be withdrawn, and with some also private initiatives where agro-industrials are bidding for raw wastewater, not even secondary clarified, to undertake design, build, and operate of the wastewater treatment plant and further tertiary treatment and further irrigation. This is 100% private. We are seeing bidding about 5 cents, 10 cents. So we are seeing some initiatives on that sense. Also in Morocco, famous Stuka project where seawater and reuse of Agadir are being matched. So those are some of the initiatives. Nevertheless, I think to go on a higher speed, we have to put the customer in the center, the final customer, the farmer. It has been issued in the Canva model of Professor, but we have to ask them which are the qualities required in order to not to mismatch copy-paste projects where, for example, you withdraw nitrates of wastewater and they are going to buy fertilizers afterwards. So give them nitrates and phosphates in a smart way, in a smart dose, so that we can save farmers' cost. In order to put the customer in the center of the discussion, the customer has to see very clearly the advantages of wastewater reclamation. The advantages, I can tell maybe 10 of them. All of us, we know them. We improve soils, organic matter. We perform better humidity in the soil, structure, productivity, better yield, savings in cost, circular economy, alignment. So for me are all advantages, but I don't know if everybody knows those advantages. And to end with that, and not to forget, because it has been said by the representative of the ministry, some homework have to be done also in the agriculture sector. Changing crops, for example, better yield with less inputs, smart food, like we see now a bit of bubble of almonds, olives, and traditional Mediterranean crops, which are very less consumptive in water and a very high yield in kilocalories per capita. And drip irrigation, still 82% of the irrigated land is not modernized. In Spain, for example, we are at 60% of modernization. And smart technologies adoption in the agriculture sector, satellite images, sensoring, etc., etc. This will add, like we have done in Spain, to reduce this famous 80% agricultural consumption to some 60–65%. I don't like to talk about agricultural consumption. I think it's a water use, because the farmer is only taking an input, which is water, to deliver another input, sometimes to agro-industry, and again to digitalization. We have power tools like water footprint calculations, which may shift the paradigm not to the volume consumed, but to water footprint used. And there we see that the agriculture sector is not that 70–80%, but maybe 1/3. And this has to be also put on the table to change a bit of the wording of the sector.
Great, thank you very much. From IFAD.
Okay, well, achieving worldwide scale for us means to include the development countries and the least developed countries, and in these countries, the poorest and most vulnerable people, and enable them in the adoption of non-conventional water resources. Normally, these people and the agriculture of these people is supported by governments financing and by development assistance, which is not enough. So the key is to seek the engagement of the private sector, not only in financing, but also in the expertise, in the innovation, and in their knowledge. In fact, to engage more with the private sector, IFAD recently changed its funding text. This is operational since August of this year, so it's a really new change of this funding text. And now IFAD can finance the private sector. So what for, or what is the objective? The objective is to mobilize private funding in enterprises and to expand markets to increase income and job opportunities for smallholder farmers. So how will this be done? Which are the tools? So one is, for example, the deployment of financial instruments to catalyze the investment of the private sector. We use IFAD's loans and grants projects and programs to crowd in the private sector. And, for example, we can develop inclusive value chains where we develop public-private producer partnerships. And another tool is to test and scale innovative technologies where we can partner with the private sector. So to attract private sector investments, there is a need of speaking the same language. And for example, there is a strategy to create, test, employ, and spread value-generating measures, and to, like Mr. Vairavamoorthy explained this morning. Sorry for if I can't pronounce your name. So I won't repeating it, but there has been this IFAD grant to the International Water Management Institute, and the product of it is a really, really good publication, which I recommend. And it is about resource recovery and reuse from waste and from wastewater. And so this publication has studied business cases, and it explains 21 resource recovery and reuse business models for governments, for the private sector, for donors. And so these 21 business models are ready to be employed and to be scaled. It includes as well 60 case studies of countries from Africa, from Latin America, and from Asia. And it includes methodological guidelines for the replication and scaling of these business models. So this publication is freely available on the internet, and I suggest for you to download it. I wanted to bring a copy, but it's like this 800 pages heavy book, so I didn't bring it, but I printed out the front page of it. And it was an IFAD grant to the International Water Management Institute, but it was with their collaboration in financing, and also with the Swiss Development Agency, with the European Union, with the World Bank, and other partners. So there is this need to shift the focus from treatment of waste for disposal to treatment of waste as a valuable resource for safe reuse. And yeah.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. María.
Thank you, Sasha. Lo bueno de dar la última es que casi todas las ideas ya se han dicho, pero
si me
permiten voy
everything has been said, so it makes my life easier. But I do have a couple more ideas which have to do with the Latin American context. And when I say the Latin American context, please understand that I'm speaking in very general terms. Of course, each country is different from the others. Each country has its own specificities. But I'm speaking in very general terms because otherwise it would take just far too long. So when we address the issue of lack of regulation, we believe indeed that it is important to change that paradigm. We believe that rules and regulations that will foster the use and reuse must adapt and adjust to the realities in each country and in each scenario. Often in Latin America, standards have been implemented that are international in origin and which are either too expensive or impossible to flesh out in the countries in question. So often, nothing really happens. We believe that it is very important to try to adapt to the specificities of each situation and each reality by implementing standards that will be rolled out slowly but surely. Some countries do not allow, for instance, for the reuse of treated waters, or they do allow for it, but only in very limited cases, which is why perhaps it's not profitable or it's too expensive to think about reclaiming water. And then on the other hand, we also need to work hard with countries. We see this paradigm shift in the lack of political will, as we heard before. But working with governments is important because often the governments don't want to take a risk because maybe the farmers are not used to paying for water, and suddenly being told you're going to have to pay for reclaimed water is going to be very difficult and can result in protests or demonstrations which politicians are wary of. And then that awareness raising, working in the circular economy, and addressing the issue of the advantages. You said that you prefer to see the advantages and not the disadvantages. Well, transmit that information and reach out and explain that this is a solution and that water is not an infinite resource, and that now, yes, we have access to water, but that's not guaranteed forward-looking, and there are challenges and indicators that allow us to understand that water is a scarce resource. With regards reusing, I think that there's a political facet. We need to work with the politicians. We need to bolster those institutions so that the persons involved are willing to tackle these challenges. And as to funding, there's a number of important points, and I was very happy to hear about the initiatives described by Oriol. But I think that these initiatives are very, very exceptional. The private sector, we believe, needs to become more involved, more engaged, and who knows, well, blended instruments perhaps are essential, and they will be perceived as attractive. We're working with the FAO, with Sastre, with TNC, to foster the use of residual waters in a sustainable manner. In other words, we know what the solutions are. They've been explained to us. We know how it's done. So now we need to understand what needs to be done and especially how, because reclaiming is absolutely essential. Because remember that there are other indirect costs costs. So you have public health, and you have food safety. So there's, as I say, another series of handles or advantages which in a business model maybe don't come through that clearly, but when addressing society, they are very clearly understood. And finally, the issue of rules and regulations. In our field, the pricing of these recovered products, the economic value of water has got to be explained. People need to understand what water is, what it represents, how much it costs, and that, yes, there is a solution. The circular economy is a solution to guarantee sustainability, and that would be the only option, really. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all your enlightening comments and solution propositions. At FAO, we're doing a lot on various of these various topics, and with the government in Spain, we have produced well in advance the cost and benefit and cost-effective analysis of reuse scenarios in comparison of Spain and Mexico in different contexts. A lot of our professors are here with us today. Also, in relation to evaluation of agriculture in relation to the reuse scenario, we're looking also at crop rotations. We look at crop water productivity in addition to nutrition-sensitive crop water use. So not only a drop per crop, but a drop per crop with nutrition value. And that is with EFOD project funded. So there are a number of opportunities, and one of you have mentioned about the consumption, reduction in consumption, and that's a demand side management. I mean, the meeting focuses on the supply, augmenting supply through the non-conventional resources. However, there is a demand side, and the EU is definitely interested in also reducing consumer demand on water and recognizing the value of water. So UN Water is, we are producing the next year's, in 2 years, the value of water report as the World Water Development Report as we move forward. Now, with the limited time, I'd like to offer the floor for any questions or interventions, reflections. I know there are many countries with similar situations as the ones represented here. So would you like to raise your hand, and the microphone will be passed to you.
Hi, I have the microphone. I'm Sandy Roger from the Toilet Board Coalition, which is a business-led coalition promoting sanitation, circular economy sanitation particularly. I just want to check if the panel would agree that we really must be talking about the reuse of water and the reuse of what we call human waste. In the Toilet Board, we call it toilet resources, because it is a resource. You can't really just look at the water and not at the solids and the nutrients and even the energy potential. So I know this is a conference about non-conventional water, but can we agree that we're talking about the complete use of the biological and water potential in these materials?
Would any of the panelists would like to address the question?
Yeah, but for sure, I mean, in development activities now we are promoting, for instance, FECA sludge management, which is being undergoing for a number of years in certain African countries like Senegal, for instance. They are very much on the technology behind. And very lately last year at the Africa Sun, which is the conference on sanitation in Africa, was promoted very much because the circular economy is indeed not present in sectors that have been always considered as the last of the sectors where development activities or also country activities should pay attention, while there is a whole list of economic activities linked to the use of and reuse of not only water but also the material, the fecal materials that are produced. So that is indeed something that will continue to be promoted, but a lot of paths need to be done yet.
So, Sylvia?
Yes, I think we don't only agree on that, but it is a must, because not only the water is scarce and getting scarcer and it needs to be reused over and over again, but also we need to feed growing global population, and this will get higher, and nutrients of soils are getting washed away, are getting depleted, soils are agricultural soils are getting poorer, so we need to reuse these nutrients. And also the energy, access to energy is still a big problem in many countries, like in Africa, and it will probably be a problem to meet the SDG on energy access. So it is a must to recover the nutrients, the organic matter, the water, and the energy out of the waste. Yes, all three of them, and there I want to address also the rural-urban linkage, because most of the waste is finally produced in urban areas, but it is needed most in rural areas. So in the agriculture, we need the water, we need the nutrients, and we need access to energy and rural electrification.
Okay.
Just to say that in Israel we try to do it, of course, and I want to emphasize actually the problem that we have been using fertilization from human sewage. We already use the water for irrigation from wastewater, so you've got many parameters that you're actually considering while doing that, but when you use also human waste in the fields for agriculture, you got a lot of parameters that we are not yet checking, and there's a consideration of the food security that is, I think, is not fully taken into account yet. So this is one thing I think we should look into it.
Thank you. Yes, from Kenya, Mr.
Sí.
Mubaruku. Oh, sorry.
Hola, buenos días. Soy Pilar Esquinas, soy de Agua Iuris, de la organización
Pilar
de usuarios.
Esquinas from Agua Iuris, Water Users and Consumers Association. And I have to say that as an organization, we are very concerned about cross-contamination, the kind of crossed pollution that you can have with these waters. The problem, I think, would be who's going to be held accountable for the possible pollution of foodstuffs when we use these reclaimed waters, because we are becoming customers, perhaps, and citizens who pay for using the water, but the money that is generated by food production. So I think, there are no reports. We really don't know what the repercussions are going to be of this process. Food is going to be transformed if these waters from our plants are used. We see that in many countries, in many regional parts of Spain, we don't know what the best possible use is being made. So I think that it's a time bomb ticking away. The food that we grow, the food that we eat, is it safe? How will we know? Who will be held accountable? If the farmer who has used reclaimed water, who's accountable? The farmer, the managing company of the reclaiming plant, or the government which has authorized it? Thank you. Yes, let me share with you what I know about Spain and accountability. In Spain, it's pretty straightforward. There's not only a number of plans in place, we also have a self-control, we have analytics and measurements which need to be performed by the plants. The person in charge, the person accountable, thinking about legislation in place, that happens each time you use it. So you're talking about farm use, but it depends on what water is going to actually be used for. Is it going to be for edible foodstuffs, depending on the type of irrigation and so on? Well, there's a series of parameters, maximum admissible values, which take two criteria into account: microbiological and physical and chemical. So quality control is essential, and there's a number of analytics which, depending, as I say, on the final use to be made of this reclaimed water, are bi-monthly, weekly, monthly, of course, and daily. And furthermore, there is a specific percentage whereby the threshold is fixed for the water to be deemed acceptable and be usable. So it's not only the owner of the plant who's accountable for the water while the water is in the plant, in the purifying plant, but at the point of delivery to users, another control is carried out, and that person is the entity who is accountable for the quality of those reclaimed waters. So I can assure you that yes, we have levels of control in place. Not only the companies, not only the entities that are accountable for those plants and facilities, but you also have the health authorities in Spain, in regional terms, must also issue a binding report regarding the plans to establish reclaiming plants. And of course, these waters have to comply with basic quality parameters. I don't know whether I've answered. In Spain, in legal terms, everything is very clear and straightforward. Control, self-control, analytical measurements to be performed by the plant owners and managers and the users. Everything is very clearly set forth, so there is no doubt about who is accountable. And we know that the percentages are very low. There have been incidents, of course, but in legal terms, I can assure you that everything is very, very clear.
Just to answer, actually comment, the FAO, we're starting a new program called the One Water, One Health initiative that looks at water as one cycle and also the health implications and the different risk assessments associated with the different levels and different approaches. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has addressed us exactly on these issues of food safety. There's a lot of genome science, metagenomics that can be used in host and genome sequencing, in identifying pathogen pathways, and also risk reduction. One last question from our gentleman from Kenya, and then we wrap up the session. Please.
Thank you, Sasha, for this opportunity. My name is Baruku Vyakweli. I'm from Nairobi City Water and Sewerage Company. And I want to thank the panelists also for their excellent presentations that they have done. I have just 2 very short questions. One, I think, will go to Shoni. Very impressive that Israel is moving to the next frontier of wastewater and desalination. But I was wondering how, because you have been told that desalination is very expensive, we know wastewater is also not doing very bad. I don't know what technology you're using for this next frontier, and how cheap do you think the water will come down? I have a bias in water because I'm also a member of the World Water Council. And then another question I think will go to Teresa, just one short question on sustainability, SDG. And I wanted to find out whether there is a proper mechanism of monitoring and evaluation, especially on developing countries, as to where we are at the moment, sustainability of SDG, especially 6, and 2. Thank you.
Okay, we are already on time, so 1 minute each, if you can.
Sure. I can just say that in wastewater treatment, we had to invest about $5 billion in the last 20 years. So it's a very large investment, and it's all coming from loans from the government and by municipalities and water companies that we have, I guess similar to what we are doing. And we failed to do it by the private sector, but it's not the same in desalination. In desalination, we have now big companies, and we have 5 desalination plants that are already at work, and 2 more are being built. Now it's about 500 million cubic meters in desalination. It's going to be about 50% more. And the prices that we get for desalination are really low. I mean, we were surprised how low it is. It's actually cheaper to use now desalinated water in Israel than to withdraw natural water from the aquifers. And I cannot elaborate about it now, but sewage treatment is getting cheaper, but it's still very expensive, especially when we are going to the tertiary quality.
Would you like to answer?
Muchísimas gracias. Yo no sé si puedo dar respuesta.
Well, I don't know if I can answer to your question. Perhaps somebody else would be able to say something if you belong to an international organization. But what I do know is the figures that we are handling today, that we are not that far away from SDG 2 than number 6. And this hunger zero affects 24% if we are speaking about hunger zero. And the objective of hunger zero, only with this data and this information, we are very far from reaching this goal from the perspective of resources, or from the water, and on objective 6, so water and sanitation. And especially if we speak about a global viewpoint, it would depend very much on the countries, on the regions in which we are located or we are speaking about. But from a global perspective, 2.1 million have not access to sanitation, and it affects from 4 out of 10 people globally, and we are very far from this objective. But at the European level, the lack of resources affects 1/3 of the European population, 11% of the population. And at national level in Spain, the figures that we have is that for year 2030, water scarcity would affect 60 or more % of the population. So with information that we have on top of the table, and I think that unfortunately we are quite far from the objectives, and as we mentioned this morning, and hopefully you will be mentioning a little bit more during tomorrow's session as well, is that we are very much aware already about the difficulty, because it seems that we are facing something which is impossible. How are we going to be able to feed a superpopulation for the year 2050 if we are going to have a growth of 50% of foodstuff with scarce resources, not only water scarcity, but as well the rest of resources in our earth, where we are subject to climate change, the access to water, and given the depopulation of the earth, it will be losing its production capability. So I think that it's going to be almost impossible to achieve these goals, but nevertheless, we should continue fighting and struggling for the same idea. I don't know if this answers to your question.
Panelists and experts, and I welcome you to speak with them, during lunchtime or any time during the symposium. And just a few announcements. Please return your headsets up there to the right. And in terms of restaurants, in Spain, the restaurants for lunch open quite late. So the ones that are already opened, and you have a list of restaurants close to the venue, B as in big is open, G as in grande is open, H as in high is open. So you're welcome to any of these restaurants near here. Thank you very much, and we see you back at 5 minutes before the next session. Thank you.